Well, good morning. Good to see you all. Thank you for coming out, being with us here at Cornerstone today. My pleasure to be able to stand before you with the Word of God here. Looking forward to that. I want to thank Billy for reading that passage out of Ephesians chapter 4. And for all of you who have served in our worship thus far, we are truly blessed to be together today as His people, serving Him and being drawn closer to Him through the Word today. Before we get into our text this morning, I want to ask you this question and just kind of let you think about it for a minute. What is the one thing that you can't take away from Christianity and still have Christianity? So just chew on that for a second. We're not talking about not what's important or not what matters. I'm talking about the one thing that if you stripped everything else away, this makes the thing that we're doing actually the thing Jesus started. And again, take a moment with that question. Now, people have given lots of answers over the years. The answer might be doctrine or Scripture. Maybe morality comes to our mind, or tradition, or better yet, the right form of worship. And some of those things I just mentioned genuinely matter. I'm not saying that they don't matter. But here's what I have noticed over the years. Every time that we try to trade the answer to that question for our right opinions, every time that we have made agreement the price of admission, we've ended up smaller. And in some cases, angrier. And in those cases, more certain that we have it right and everybody else missed it and got it wrong. A couple of weeks ago, you may remember that we opened up our lesson by taking a look at Raccoon John Smith. This is a man that said that he lived so far back in the hills that his only neighbors were raccoons. This was a man that was largely self-educated. He had no more than 6 months of formal schooling, and yet, as we said, he became one of the most powerful preachers of his generation. Now, he grew up a Calvinistic Baptist. That was his whole world. The confession of faith, the doctrine of election, the whole system. And in his early life, he preached it. As you just saw in 1814, his two oldest children were killed in a house fire. And the news reached John while he was out preaching, and his anguish was compounded by the realization that there was nothing in Calvin's doctrine of election that could give him any consolation, any reassurance that his children were safe with God. He couldn't comfort his wife. Her face never brightened again, and soon afterward, after those two children died, she got sick and died herself. So John Smith lost his two children and then his wife, and then the theological system that he had been given from his early days of life gave him nothing to hold on to. For John Smith, this was not a doctrinal dispute. This is a man standing over 3 graves asking whether the system that he had given his life to was actually true. And his examination of the Scriptures led him to conclude that the Calvinism that he so long had preached was, in his own words, quote, a doctrine of the wind with no foundation in Scripture. Someone handed him a copy of Alexander Campbell's journal, The Christian Baptist. Campbell was doing something that Smith had long been looking for, and that was stripping away the creedal machinery and asking a much more simple question: what does the Bible actually say? In the spring of 1824, Smith rode 20 miles from his home to hear Campbell speak. He rode a horse, he said, that had seen better days and a suit of clothes that didn't fit. He said those were small matters. He would have walked if he had to. And he sat down and listened to Campbell, who preached for 2.5 hours. Can you imagine that? He said it only seemed like 30 minutes. And after that, he said, I'm done with the Baptist. And it's not because he stopped loving them. In fact, as you read his biography, he would go to great lengths to never cause division. He strongly agreed with the Calvinist ideology, and he loved the people, but he didn't want their disassociation. But what he was finished with was letting the church brand define the boundaries of his faith. Did you hear that? He said, I'm done with that. And that is what he had seen his entire life. Groups splitting from groups and labels multiplying and Baptist associations trying twice and failing over the course of just a few years to unite and bring brethren from their hardline sector and get them with the more relaxed congregations to work together. And it failed. They couldn't do it. There were too many opinions. There were too many loyalty tests. There were too many lines drawn in places that the Bible had never drawn. If you think about the frontier religious atmosphere of this country in the 1820s, it was often as fierce and divisive as the secular politics of the day. Every group was convinced that they alone were right. And these aren't bad people. They believe in the Bible. They loved Jesus, or at least said that they did, but when it came down to it, their deepest loyalty wasn't to Jesus, it was being a Baptist. And that was the line. And cross it, and you're out. And question it, and you're a traitor. And it doesn't matter how much you love the Lord, if you don't love Him our way, then you don't belong here. And so while others identified themselves by their group's title, Raccoon John only carried one label: Christian. And by 1832, the two movements, the Stone Campbell movement, was growing. The two groups had hardcore convictions, but they had never fully joined hands. And John Smith saw one more wall that didn't need to be there. And he had already watched brand loyalty masquerade as faithfulness over his entire life. And he said, I'm not going to let that happen again. And so on January 1st, 1832, in Lexington, he said, there are 1,000 opinions and one faith, and we can only unite on the faith. That wasn't a nice sentiment from a man who'd never been burned. This was a man who had buried his children and buried his wife and buried his Baptist identity and came out on the other side knowing exactly what matters and what doesn't. This is what I want you to see today. Raccoon John Smith didn't arrive at his convictions about unity by reading a book on unity. He arrived there by losing everything that wasn't at the center. Strip away the Calvinist creed, what's left? Jesus. Strip away the Baptist label, what's left? Jesus. Strip away the labels and strip away the factions and the loyalty tests, what's left? One Lord, one faith, one baptism. That's it. That's the whole thing. And 2,000 years before Raccoon John Smith buried his children and rode 20 miles on a horse to find something, Paul wrote it down in a single paragraph. 7 words. 7 ones. Now keep in mind, when Billy just read from that passage in Ephesians 4, that's not Paul building a system. That's not Paul handing the church a creed. That's not Paul handing down which opinions are acceptable before you could belong. What Paul is saying in those verses 4 through 6 is, here is what is already true about you. Look at this. There is one body and one Spirit, just as you were called to one hope at your calling, one Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all, who is above all and through all and in all. So look at that list. Just look through the pages of your Bible right there in Ephesians 4. Not one opinion. Not one tradition. Not one way of doing everything. It is one Lord. That is the center. Everything else, and I mean everything, orbits around that. Jesus is Lord. And so what Smith figured out, at the cost of his own tremendous personal pain, Paul is giving to us right here for free. The question is not, do we agree on everything? The question is, do we share the one thing? And if the answer is yes, then we're already one. And the only question left is, will we live like it? So let's talk for a few moments about the ones that we didn't build. So I'm going to go back to our text. This is Ephesians 4, and we're going to fill in some blanks now and really let this passage sink into our hearts. There is, Paul says, one body, one Spirit, just as you were called to one hope at your calling. And then he says one Lord, one faith, and one baptism. And then in the next verse, one God and Father above all. Notice, Paul doesn't say here, try to reach one body. He says there is one body. Paul doesn't say here, try to reach one faith. He says there is one faith. And by the way, everyone, as you go back and look again at this list, okay, everything here, the one body, the one Spirit, the one hope, the one Lord, the one faith, the one baptism, the one Father, all of these things are a declaration. A declaration. They're written in present tense. They're already true. This is not a vision statement. This is not a challenge for the church to try to rise to and reach someday. It is a description of what already exists. Because again, in so many ways, what we've tried to do, I think, at least in my experience, is we tried to treat unity as a construction project. Like it's something we can build if we just get enough people to agree on enough things. Like if we work hard enough and we sacrifice enough, we give up some of our preferences, and we give up some of those difficult conversations, then maybe, just maybe, we'll get there and be one. That is not what Paul is saying. Again, read the text. He's saying you are already there. Before God created any of us, there was already oneness. Now, listen carefully. We have to be careful here. Understand this. Paul is not saying here to wave your hand at every religious group and say you're all one, doctrine doesn't matter, just get along. That's not what this text is saying. Listen carefully. There is one body. It is the body of Jesus Christ. And that is made up of people who have responded to the gospel, people who have been buried in baptism, and people who have the Spirit living within them. That is the one faith that centers on Christ, the gospel itself, not a watered-down version of it. This is not talking about ecumenicalism. But here is what it is. It is a word to us. People who already share the one Lord and the one faith and the one baptism. And the lesson is, how do we treat one another? Look around this room. You already share the 7 ones with every person sitting here in this room. The problem I'm describing here isn't out there somewhere It happens when people who share all of this somehow fail to manage how they treat one another, sometimes like strangers or worse. Think about us locally, right here, Cornerstone. What do these 7 ones mean for us? Well, there's one body. What is that? That's every blood-bought believer who belongs to Jesus and are held together by Him. There's one Spirit. The Spirit living in you is living in the person sitting next to you. You didn't coordinate that. God did. One hope. All the people inside this room share the hope of the same destination, the same promise, the same resurrection after this life is over. That's waiting for every one of us. We share one Lord, not one interpretation of the Lord, not one tradition about the Lord, but the same Jesus who called you has called your brother and your sister. The same Jesus who died for you died for the person sitting on this side of the room as well. One faith. That's the body of truth centered on Jesus, the gospel itself. Not my opinions about the gospel, the gospel. One baptism, that moment when each one of us here was buried with Him and raised to walk in newness of life. One God and Father of all. Think about 7 ones. And every single one of these things was true before you had anything to say about it. You didn't earn your place in the one body. You were called into it. You didn't generate the Spirit. He was given to you. You didn't negotiate your way into the one hope. It was promised to you. It's a gift. All of it. Listen, the moment that we start treating unity like it's something we build, that's the moment that we get to decide who qualifies to be in it. We set the terms, we draw the lines, we determine who's in and who's out based on and how they measure up to our standards. But if unity is something that we've been given, if it's already been established by God before we showed up, then we don't get to decide who's in. God already did. Look with me at Romans 8. Here's verse 30. Those He predestined, He what? He called. Those He called, He also what? Justified. And those He justified, He also glorified. Listen. When Jesus Christ looks at the brother or sister that you've been keeping at arm's length, whether that someone is in this room or someone in a congregation across town that we have questions about, or someone else in the brotherhood that we've been taught to keep our distance from, when Jesus looks at that brother or sister, He sees someone who has been called. He sees someone that has been justified. He sees someone that He is carrying to glory. And that happened before we have any opinion about it. So the question here is not how do we become one. The fact of the matter is we are one. And the question is, will we act like it? Now, if oneness is given and not built, if Christ has already called and justified and is carrying toward glory the very people that we may have been drawing lines against, why is it so hard to live this? Because sometimes we can take these 7 ones and again start building walls inside them. One body, but only if you worship exactly the way I do. I'll tell you where this challenged me the first time. Now, many of you have not traveled outside of the United States. But if you have traveled outside of the United States, you will find very quickly that brethren around the world do not worship like we do. Have you seen this? Okay, for example, the first time I went to Colombia. No, I'm going to go back. I'm going to back up. I'm going to talk about Ukraine. because I was much younger then and just kind of new to doing mission work. The first time I walked in, and listen, I grew up taking the Lord's Supper with these little tiny cups like we did this morning, okay? The little sippy plastic cup things, right? And that's great. Listen, that's a purely American thing. You know how I learned this? When I went to Ukraine, the first Sunday, they whip out shot glasses. Okay? And I mean, they were, about like this, and they were full of grape juice. I'm like, yes! Okay? I got some real grape juice today, although it wasn't Welch's. I'll be careful with that. But there are all sorts of things I learned, and I was sitting there going, this is strange. And you know what my upbringing said? Ooh, this could be unscriptural. Okay? So we do this. One body, only if you worship exactly the way that we do. One faith, only if you land where I land on every question. One Lord, yes, but your understanding of what it means to follow Him must match my understanding completely. One baptism, we all agree on that, I hope. But what comes after that? And before long, the body has fractures running all the way through it. Not because the foundation cracked, because in a lot of cases we kept adding floors that it was never designed to build. Listen to what Paul writes. Romans 14. Welcome anyone who is weak in the faith. This is what I want you to hear. Don't argue about disputed matters. Listen to that. Sometimes it'd just be better if we would listen to that. Don't argue about disputed matters. Skip down to verse 4. Who are you to judge another's household servant? Before the Lord he stands or falls, listen, and he will stand because who? The Lord is able to make him stand. Listen, this is not some gentle suggestion. This is Paul going right to the heart of what happens when we make our own opinions the standard that everyone else has to meet. That person you're looking down on, or that person you're not sure about, that person whose conclusions don't exactly wind up with yours on every question, they're not your servant, they're His. They belong to the Lord. And the Lord is perfectly capable of managing His household without our help. Now again, listen carefully. I'm not saying doctrine doesn't matter, truth matters, sound teaching matters. There are things we need to stand firm on, and we don't need to pretend otherwise. But there's a difference between standing firm on the gospel and making every opinion, every preference, every tradition, every secondary conclusion as a test of fellowship. Because when opinion and speculation becomes tests of fellowship, it always creates division. Without exception. And you see it in every split, in every faction, in every fellowship in the Restoration Movement history. And you see this pattern at its root. Someone, somewhere decided that their take on things was right and is as important as the faith itself. And then they found people that agreed with them. And then they all started wondering about the others that didn't agree with them. And the circle gets smaller and smaller and smaller until eventually you have a group that is absolutely certain that they alone have everything right. And they grind themselves down to nothing and wonder why they don't grow. Paul said it this way. Here's Galatians 5. If you what? Bite and devour one another, watch out. Or what? You will be consumed by one another. This is what happens when we replace the unity God gave us with the standards that we invent. We pick at each other, we draw finer and finer lines, we challenge each other's faithfulness with things that have nothing to do over the gospel, and eventually what happens? We consume each other. Now, over the course of March, we focus a lot on this passage, Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 2. These are the attitudes necessary to help preserve the unity that we've been given. But I want to focus on verse 3, making every effort to keep the unity of the Spirit. Listen, my job, your job, is not to break what God has given. What is that? When you look at verse 3, this is the daily, unglamorous, and even costly work of living inside the unity God has established. And if I choose to ignore that, and I make the decision, I'm going to build walls, listen, I'm not protecting the faith. I am vandalizing something God built. The one body does not need us to defend it by dividing it. It needs us to inhabit it. So, one faith, it means something. The oneness has been given. We don't build it. We don't earn it. It is given. And we need to be honest with what we do with it. Too often we build walls inside of it that God did not want to be built. And we bite and devour until nothing's left. But listen, I know some of you may be wondering if unity is something that we've been given. If we just accept anybody who shares the 7 ones, doesn't that mean that anything goes? Doesn't that actually open the door to compromising on the things that matter? Well, that's a fair question, and now I want to take you to verse 5. Verse 5. And I want to talk about one faith. That one faith means something. Listen, it is not a blank check. It is not believe all you want to believe and label it Christianity. What is this one faith? Jim and I were actually talking about this before church. He had no idea what I was preaching today. But we always think alike almost. What is the one faith? The one faith that Paul is describing here has content. It centers on Christ. It is grounded in the gospel. It is the faith delivered once and for all to the saints. It's not negotiable. The cross is not negotiable. The resurrection is not negotiable. The lordship of Jesus is not negotiable. Baptism into His death and resurrection are not negotiable. And that's the center, and that holds. The center is narrow enough to be meaningful and wide enough to be generous. Narrow enough to know that not everything qualifies, and wide enough, listen, wide enough to think that more people qualify than maybe we've been willing to admit. And I want to take you back to 1832. Raccoon John Smith stands up in front of 2 groups of people who had real differences. I mean, I'm talking significant theological differences. One of the easiest examples of this was Smith's reliance on emotion and the dwelling of the Spirit versus Campbell, who was all head and logic. Now, by the way, as you look at the last 200 plus years of history within the churches of Christ, who won that battle? Campbell. Because we have become a very logic-based religion. We've stressed the head more than the heart. That was one difference. There were methodological differences. There were differences about how to read certain texts and apply those in the practices that we engage in religiously. And here is Smith coming in that day on January 1st, 1832, saying, we unite on one faith, not one opinion. And he's not saying your opinions don't matter. He's not saying pretend that those differences don't exist. But what he is saying is that faith that centers on Jesus is enough to hold us together. And it's always been enough. And we got to stop making the weight of our opinions to be added on top of that. And listen, this is the big struggle of our day. Faith versus opinion. That is everything. So how do you define that? Faith is what God has revealed. Faith is what God has revealed. Opinion is what we've concluded. Now listen, both matter. Both matter. But they don't carry the same weight. And the moment that we fail to tell the difference between them, the moment that my conclusions feel as authoritative as the gospel itself, that's when the circle begins to shrink. And that's when the biting and consuming one another begins. And that's when we end up with a group of people who believe they are absolutely certain they have it all right. And that is a church that is slowly consuming itself from the inside. Listen, we are not perfect. I definitely am not perfect. And there are people right here at Cornerstone who disagree about certain things, real things, not imaginary things. And we need to get to the point where we say, that is okay. Because again, the question was not whether we ever agreed on everything. The question is, how do we share the one thing? One Lord, one faith, one baptism. And if that be the case, then the people in this room, we are one. And it's not because we have ironed out every wrinkle. It's not because we've resolved every tension. It's not because we've gotten everybody to see it our way. It's because the Lord said so. So, 4 weeks ago, can you believe it? We're at the end of March. I'm actually excited for several reasons. March is not one of my favorite months. It drags. It's not as bad as January. You know why it is? Because we've gotten teased with it being warmer, and then we get mornings like today where it's 36. I'm ready for it to just be 65 all the time, right? But I digress. 4 weeks ago, we had a lesson and we asked the question, what is killing our unity? And we've really sat with that question the entire month of March. And we've looked at what we make primary sometimes should be made secondary. We've looked at what Jesus actually prayed for the night that he was arrested. And we've talked about the hard, often unglamorous work of peace. And now today, as we wrap up the month, it comes down to this: 7 ones. Not 7 goals. Not 7 ideals that we're working toward. 7 declarations of what is already true about every person who belongs to Christ, who is part of one body, who has one Spirit, who has one Lord, and is part of one faith, and has been baptized in the one baptism, and has one Father who is Lord and Father of all. Listen, that's not a vision statement. That is reality. Now, will we live like it? Will we live like it? What does this mean for me and you personally? Am I willing to stand in the gap? If there is someone that I have been keeping my distance from, will I take the initiative to move closer to them? Not because they've earned it, not because that tension has been resolved, not because everything is comfortable, but because Jesus closed the gap for me when I hadn't earned it either. That's why I move closer. And that is what the entire month of March has been about. Welcoming one another just as Christ welcomed us. Making every effort to keep the unity of the Spirit through the bond of peace. Uniting on one faith, not one opinion. And so this morning, if you are not part of that one body, then I want you to know that the door is open. Jesus died for you, so that we could be a part of Him. That's what this is about. Everything goes back to this. Listen, every one of us have been on this terrestrial ball for some of us 90 plus years, others just a few months. But we're all here. We're on this thing. And guess what? One day our lives are going to end if the Lord doesn't come back. Bottom line is you're going to die. The question is, where are you going to be after that? That's what this is all about. Every bit of it. We're preparing our life to die. Where will you wake up on the other side? That's the question. And the danger is none of us know the day we're going to die. Could be today. I hope not. But it could be. A giant meteor could fly out of the sky. We've been having all these meteors lately. Maybe you could just fly out of the sky and that's it. Maybe that'd be the best way to go. Wouldn't last long. You'd wake up on the other side. But here's the thing. You're going to wake up on the other side and you're going to know. And at that moment, there's no going back. This is serious. Are you ready? Jesus died so you will be ready. And we want you to take advantage of that now and become a part of Him and a part of us. Can we help you do that? Everything's ready. Why don't you come forward as we stand and sing.